So that epic video kind of blew up, hey? It's tabletop time, I'm Dave, and today I'm gonna bring you more old things. Sort of. So you all gave me license to create what I would love to create, showing me that you enjoyed my nerdy deep dives into the history of various parts of 40k. And today I'd like to share with you the history of the Sabre Strike tank.
Saber.
Oh, it's Saber.
Yes.
Of course.
Oh,
Saber.
But I don't like to give lectures without having the object in hand. So I've got my very own Sabre Strike tank, and I'm gonna be building and painting it for my brand new Alpha Legion army for the Horus Heresy Age of Darkness in this video, while also diving into some of the background of where it came from and where it stands today. So thanks for giving me the license to go in deep on another bit of 40k lore. Let's do it.
Now this Sabre tank was something that I had excitedly bought when Horus Heresy Age of Darkness came out, and not knowing I was going to make a video, I actually assembled it at home. Now being a Forge World kit, I found this one to be actually really easy to put together, and in my experience, the smaller the Forge World kit, the easier and better time you have of it. Nevertheless, there are a few weapon options I still needed to clean up the mold lines of and get prepared for priming and painting. Now starting a new Horus Heresy army means establishing a new paint scheme, and I dabbled a little bit in my previous Chaos Raptor video, but ultimately had decided it came out too green. It's too close to the new Sons of Horus paint scheme, so I wanted to inject a little bit more blue into the scheme. Initially, I had started by base coating them all Cantor blue in an attempt to connect them with my 40k Chaos. However, I got a bit experimental and used a purple spray and found I really liked this, and eventually decided on working with a purple base coat, which then had a jade green airbrush coming in from a 45-degree angle from the top, and then coming in with a zenithal of Ahriman blue. This way we have a little bit of a mix of that green and blue, but overall the highlight color comes up to a blue. Once the model was airbrushed, I decided that I actually wanted to be able to swap and change the weapon options. So I tried to mark out some points in a Posca pen, and yeah, it just went everywhere and it was awful, and I rapidly cleaned that up and decided to use good old-fashioned paint instead to mark where I was going to put my magnets. On this large, chunky Forge World model, I wasn't afraid to grab the Dremel and use this, but I did make sure to wear respiratory protection because inhaling fine particles of resin is a very bad idea. After the holes were drilled and I'd cleaned up all that nasty resin dust, I glued in some 3mm neodymium magnets, and I was set to swap and change the front gun on this tank. With the magnets glued into the hull, I took some gold paint and painted them using a huge dollop and not letting it dry. This way I could press fit in the weapon options and the magnets would be lined up on the weapons and on the chassis. The two weapon options I had for my tank were the twin autocannons and the Volkite weapon. Now initially I was leaning towards the autocannons, but the more I looked at it, I think I'm going to stick with the Volkites. It's magnetized for later use, but in the few test games I've played, the autocannons don't really feel like they have a place, and I'd much rather that Martian death ray experience.
So I thought I'd take the opportunity to go into the journey of where the Sabre tank came from and its origins at Games Workshop. As many of us may have noticed, it is quite rare in today's day and age for Games Workshop to come up with something brand new out of nowhere. Most of their current lineup, especially for Forge World kits, generally stem from some old Rogue Trader or Warhammer Epic era model. And bizarrely, even though the Sabre only came out in 2019, it has the same origin story. Looking back at issue 120 of White Dwarf, released in 1989, we have this very cool article introducing the Sabre into the worlds of Warhammer 40k. And in this, it introduces the Sabre as a light, turretless tank hunter, predominantly armed with autocannons or las cannons. It was built on the Rhino chassis, which as we all know has been designed to be easily modified and to be used as a platform for multi-role vehicles. Supposedly, the Sabre was developed at the start of the Horus Heresy to deal with the need for a rapidly increasing amount of anti-tank firepower as Legion clashed against Legion, and the bulk of the article introduces the vehicle in its most memorable encounter, a fight with Dark Angel's forces against Chaos Renegades and their Orc freebooter allies. Of course, in 1989, we were already referencing things like Chaos and their constant alliances with Orcs that you don't really see these days much anymore. In the story, Dark Angel's captain Icon Mandro sets up his carefully positioned tank hunters on the edges of two cliffs and manages to pin an entire Orc column of armor on a giant indestructible bridge of adamantium, destroying their lead and rear vehicles and making it impossible for them to escape, and then picking them off from a distance. Now, this iteration of the Saber was definitely based off the original Rhino very clearly, and they in fact teach you how to do it in the article. It's rather cool to see an article explaining exactly how to scratch build your own modifications, giving you templates and measurements for you to cut out of plastic card, suggestions such as using plastic tube or even a pen for the barrel of the gun. But overall is a really cool piece of Warhammer history.
So it was time to pay respect to those origins and get some paint on this model with a brush. To do this base coating step, I decided to go with a charcoal black for the tracks. Traditionally, I had always painted tracks with metallic silver paints. Recently, I've seen a lot of pictures of real-world tanks and realized that most of their tracks seem to just be black. So I'll be going with this on my Saber. With the track color painted in, it was time for me to move on to all the areas that would be that brassy metallic. This scheme was something I first worked on with my 40k Chaos Obliterator and then my classic Raptors, and I'm super happy with it. It's using Vallejo's charred brown, and I paint this on all of the industrial metallic areas in concert with regular silvers. But before I could get to those, I went with the irregular silvers. That's the shiny trim color on my 40k Alpha Legion. Now in Horus Heresy, there's not much trim, so this accent color was pretty much left for the copula and the small amount of trim around the driver's vision port, because there is nothing like drawing bright, shiny attention to the weak points of your vehicle. Now the mechanical silvers on my model, I also paint non-metallic metal, and they start at the same color as the tracks, which is a charcoal black from Vallejo. So I painted all of these areas, the vents, the grates, parts of the exhaust, and a lot of the weapons in these gray, and with that, the base coating was pretty much done. And with the base coating done, it was time to start finishing some of these colors off. And the first one I chose was that dark bronzy metallic. So for these bronze areas, I follow a fairly traditional non-metallic metal method where I'm painting dark colors, building up a lot of contrast, and then coming up to very bright highlights in the raised surfaces. Now, we actually have a video on how to tackle non-metallic metal like this on the channel, and you can check it out in the little card up above. Now for those areas aside from the tracks that I had originally painted in that charcoal black, I follow a very similar non-metallic metal method as I did with the brass areas. This time, however, using the colors of somber gray and wolf gray to get a subtle little blue tone into the steel. Something of note that was an interesting experience for me while I was painting this was it was my first time ever doing non-metallic metal on a vehicle. This was the largest thing I've ever tried to paint these techniques on, and it certainly was a little bit different. It's difficult to decide where to put the reflections and the shadows on something you can see 360 degrees around. It's something I look forward to practicing more as I continue to build the army. Now, before I spend any time getting that bright silver area painted, I thought I would get in and paint all the lenses orange. Orange is a really good contrasting color to purples and greens. It just looks great next to them. And I've always traditionally done orange lenses on my Chaos Space Marines. I'll also be doing them on my Alpha Legion. So for the tank's copula, where it has all these little lenses, I just went with orange as well. So it would tie in really nicely to the rest of the army. And as for the bright silver, I go into this in a bit more detail in the Chaos Obliterator video, but it's once again a very similar basic non-metallic technique. However, I'm mixing in little bits of browns with the silver to try and just make it feel a little bit different from the other metallics. In painting hindsight, I don't actually think I pushed the contrast on this area of the model nearly far enough, and it's one area I may consider changing in the future models, just increasing that contrast and those reflections as I paint more models in this army.
So it was in 2019, a full 30 years after its original appearance in White Dwarf, it received a full plastic kit by Forge World. Interestingly, at the time, Tony Cottrell was the Forge World lead, and funnily enough, was the original creator of the kit from that White Dwarf article. I wonder if he'd been wanting to create that for 30 years and finally got his chance, or if he was just looking through his old catalog of things he'd made and wanted to pitch it to the team. Nevertheless, what we got was a really cool and unique Forge World kit. The lore that had been based on the Rhino had started to feel a little bit looser, as this is probably the most different to the Rhino I've ever seen. In fact, the chassis itself sits lower than a Rhino, and the stripped down shape makes it feel more like the little brother to the Sakaran. There's extra size engines on the front and a properly built side mount on the front for the gun. This iteration of the tank was released for Horus Heresy, and it was here in an environment where 30 years of development had seen the creation of big tank hunters, super heavy tanks. That meant the way the Sabre was initially pitched didn't really fly anymore. So we see a bit of a rebrand in 2019, where the Sabre turns into this rapid assault strike tank. It has fast engines, a lot of maneuverability, but so armor. But where it really counts is it's a modern vehicle by Space Marine standards, mounting a whole bunch of interesting and exotic weaponry, usually designed for taking out enemy tanks and then retreating before they can retaliate. The model kit launched with 3 primary weapon options and a bunch of pintle options. It came with snub autocannons as default, which was a twin-linked autocannon that boasted shorter range but higher strength and was designed to take down light vehicles to medium vehicles pretty easily. It also came with a shrunk down neutron laser called the Neutron Blaster, which punched so far above the Sabre's weight class for taking down tanks, it's not funny. And finally, the Volkite Seeker, which is basically just another Volkite weapon. Another way to say choom and microwave your foes at distance. This iteration of the tank also introduced the Sabre missiles, which were one-shot missiles that were effectively weaker hunter-killer missiles. A lore snippet states that they originally mounted hunter-killer missiles, but the tank's chassis couldn't handle the velocity of launch, which doesn't really make any sense. I mean, like infantry can fire missiles, like anti-tank missiles, and hunter-killer missiles can be stuck on the prow of pretty much anything. So this just seems a bit weird to me, and really seems like an excuse for balancing not putting 4 hunter-killer missiles on a single platform. However, these shrunk down Sabre missiles were cheap and had rending, so you could still do some damage to mid-range vehicles with them.
So it was time for me to paint the treads on this tank, as all the pesky metallics were done. For the tracks, I went for a fairly rough and ready appearance, as treads on a tank are a heavily weathered part of the model. For colors, I went for Citadel Storm Vermin Fur and Skaven Blight Dinge. Personally, I absolutely love these 2 colors. They're some of my favorite grays in any paint range. They just have this lovely brown tone to them that separates them from all the other grays and lets you use 2 dark gray colors side by side and have them look completely different. Now, when I thought about highlighting the blue areas on the tank, I had a little bit of a crisis. I wasn't sure if I wanted to go for the traditional, just highlighted in a brighter version of the same color, or if I wanted to do something a little bit more wild, remembering the classic Alpha Legion paint schemes and using a venomous green to highlight all of this. I tried both methods and ultimately I decided I liked neither. So I went and got an entirely new paint, Temple Guard Blue from Citadel. It was a little bit softer than the blue I'd tried to paint as a highlight earlier, and still had a tiny hint of the green tones of the tank, and ultimately I think this is the best of the 3 paints that I tried. So with the paint chosen, I just went and line highlighted this entire model. We all know how that works. It's time consuming and satisfying in equal measure. Now, it was time for me to try something new. I have never painted a Volkite weapon before because I'm a 40k Chaos player and we just don't get those toys. I want all my energy weapons to be wildly different across my army so they're super visual at tabletop level what my dudes are armed with. So for Volkite, I went with the red Martian Death Ray that we've often seen in the art. I decided to use an airbrush to create that great soft glow effect, but I couldn't be too harsh with this glow because one of the unfortunate downsides of magnetizing weapons is if I create a really cool glow and paint it on the tank, which would be realistic, and then swap the weapon for a different weapon, that's just going to look really weird. So I tried to keep the glow controlled in its distribution and didn't spread it too far from the coils. Now to keep working on this glow, I built up multiple layers of oranges into the reds and just softly built those gradients towards the lower part of the coils, trying to improve the glow effect. Now this was my first time attempting this kind of glow effect on a vehicle, and I have to say it just wasn't quite popping for me. So here we have no footage because I couldn't let it go. I took this home and I actually followed a tutorial by LPP at Insta, and there was an awesome tutorial on how to do green energy glow on Volkites, and I just basically translated that across to red.
So we're now in 2022, and amazingly we've seen a huge relaunch of Horus Heresy in their new Age of Darkness box set. I am incredibly into it, incredibly excited, and diving headfirst into building my Alpha Legion. I'm super hyped. And I'd always eyed off the Sabre tank and I couldn't resist getting one. However, with the new release of Age of Darkness, there have been some changes to the Saber. Not so much in terms of lore, but more in terms of how it performs on the battlefield. I actually purchased my Saber in preparation for the Age of Darkness rules, so I grabbed the Anvil snub autocannons for mine, and also the Volkite guns just because I like Volkite. However, upon launching into the new edition, the snub autocannons have actually dropped a point in strength, which I considered to be a significant debuff in their ability to deal with light and medium vehicles. Not only that, but autocannons in general have changed. A lot of the lighter vehicles in the game, such as land speeders and dreadnoughts, have all now moved into the category of monstrous creatures by the old definition. They have wounds and armor saves, much the same as infantry. This means the targets that autocannons predominantly would have preyed on in the previous editions just don't exist anymore in the same way, and autocannons are vastly less effective at dealing with those multi-wound, lower toughness creatures. Sure, they're wounding on a low roll, but they've got multiple wounds to get through. They're not going to be snagging penetrating hits and immobilizing land speeders, causing them to crash and explode. As well as this, the Saber missiles have lost rending, which means they're no longer able to push threat into light and medium vehicles as well. They're just 5-point strength 6 AP4 weapons. And for me, that just doesn't really sell the deal as something that can go around and hunt light tanks. However, the Neutron Blaster excels. It seems really cool, and I would actually love to get some to fulfill those tank hunting roles. I don't think the autocannon and Saber missile combo really works anymore, and it's almost like we've gone back to the 1989 iteration, where you kind of need to pick a heavy anti-tank weapon to be an anti-tank platform. With that said, I chose to complete mine with the Volkite weapons. A Volkite Culverin mounted on top, a Volkite Saker on the bottom. This thing's pumping out 11 shots and will pose a very cheap threat to a lot of infantry, zipping around the battlefield and putting pressure where I need it. However, those Saber missiles, I think they'll be staying off the vehicle. I'd actually love to hear my fellow Horus Heresy players' comments. What's your appraisal of the Saber? It's in a really weird spot right now because it's one of the only fast attacks that's still a vehicle. It can do some really cool things, it's got some interesting loadouts, but I kind of think the way it used to work has changed from the way it has to work now. I don't know, it's changed. What do you think?
Now, the final steps to getting any Horus Heresy tank ready is to get it nice and grimy. I like a sort of in-between between parade standard and battlefield weathered, as if my vehicles have seen a little bit of combat and been deployed on operation, but do get well maintained between each mission. The first step for my weathering process is to use a sponge to sponge on some dark charcoal colors around anywhere where heavy constant weathering would be occurring, especially around the tracks where dirt would be kicked up. Once this is done, I use the same color on a brush just to pick out some scratches in horizontal lines or chips in modeled areas and basically amplify the effect of the sponging in some choice areas to make focal points of weathering. With the first step of weathering done, it was time for me to put some transfers on the model, so I used my Forge World Alpha Legion transfer sheet and placed a few Alpha Legion symbols around the model. I use Mr. Mark Setter and Softer to allow the transfer to adhere smoothly onto the model and to help blend it in once it is set. This takes multiple layers over several hours, so make sure you just come back to it when each layer dries and apply another layer. To give the effect of depth, I grab the highlight color, which was Temple Guard Blue, and I paint carefully underneath all of the chips and scratches, just on the lower half of that charcoal black. This makes it look like the paint has chipped away and the light is just catching the top of that flaky paint on the lower part of the battle damage. And the final step for this tank was weathering pigments. I grabbed dark slate gray and burnt umber, and using an old brush, applied these liberally. I used the burnt umber very heavily around the tracks, and that's because these reddish soil colors just go so well with the Alpha Legion paint scheme. I also applied a little bit of the slate gray around the engines, creating soot near the vents, and I actually did 2 layers of this weathering pigment, really heavily applying it, especially on the tracks, to leave that chunky debris built up as if dirt had been captured between each track link and was carried around the tracks. With that all done, I set it with some airbrush thinner and we were good to go.
So here it is, my finished Sabre Strike tank. I'm pretty happy with the results. Thank you to everyone who's watched the video so far, and an extra special thank you to our patrons, without whom we could not possibly put out 2 of these videos every week. It is monumental, and it is literally because of you all that we can do what we do. And thank you to our newest patrons, Roman Oreo, Parsios, Kalawat, Mark Anderson, Sanjay Badhan, and AS Alpha Wolf Gamer. Welcome to the club. Make sure you check out our Discord, where you can chat to the crew, meet other hobbyists, and share your whips, enthusiasm, finished products, all the other stuff. Can't wait to see you there. It's my tank. My tiny, tiny tank. I'm super happy with it. It's really cool. Thanks for hanging out. If you want to see more of this kind of video, make sure you like and subscribe. I'd love to keep making them. More history dives on more stuff would be fantastic. A bunch of my friends just got together and they bought me a Legion Glaive super heavy tank for my birthday. So if you want to see a dive into the lore of Legion super heavy tanks, as well as me painting up a glaive on the channel, make sure you show the video some love. Click on some likey likes and comment in the comments. If this is the kind of stuff you want to see from Tabletop Time, I can make that happen. Please, let me make that happen. Now, back to Mum's basement.